Mahdi.
Por un lindo día, mi amigo el pajarito.
Por un lindo día, mi amigo el pajarito
Caminaba por la calle chiflando su cantadito.
caminaba por las calles chiflando su cantadito.
Se subió a la rama de un lindo arbolito.
Se subió a la rama de un lindo arbolito,
Buscando la papaya que tenía más juguito.
buscando la papaya que tenía más juguito. Pajarito que se acerca, pajarito se le antoja.
Can you give me a countdown? Hello, my name is Mahdi Al-Khaifi, and I'm a fifth-year architecture student at the Spitzer School of Architecture at City College in New York. I'm currently a fifth-year student, and I'll be graduating in May 2021. The line drawings have a certain goal that they're trying to convey, and then the expressional drawings have a different goal. But the line drawings are something that is almost universal. It can be used as a tool in the same way that we use the sections and the elevations of the Soleimani Mosque to make those shadow drawings, in the way that we use the plan drawing, the site plan, to make the shadow cast of the plan drawing. So we're using the line drawing as a tool to make other drawings that can't be conveyed on the line drawing, or can be conveyed but they have to be overlaid. So the drawing itself isn't solely by itself, that's all it's showing. It's showing what's there. The reading is very limited because it's very factual. You can't counter whatever's on there. So the Invisible Cities project, that's the one with the modules. The premise of the project was to think more critically about how a city is put together. We did that through these small units, which were the modules. The modules were the measurement of what a lot in the city would be. The project was to kind of develop a system, a way which these pieces with the modules are able to be assembled in a systematic way, but are able to kind of grow on their own. I created a system, a grid system, that's overlaid on the surface as to which these pieces are put upon. And the system consists of a regular grid, a Cartesian grid, which is perpendicular, but it also includes a diagonal, and that diagonal adds another layer of possibilities with the modules. So they're no longer perpendicular to each other where they're just, running like this, but now they're able to kind of start turning and make different kinds of forms, all from one single module, but they're all still following the syntax, which is the grid. Through the use of this material, which is just this plain white material, it kind of blanks it and gives it the opportunity to be implied in other places. So it's not site specific, but it's more about the system. In a project like this, it's not so much about context as it is to think about the possibilities of designing something. Instead of, for example, taking this and kind of sketching it out, making a drawing, see how I can work this out, I started off by just making these units, which are very simple rectangles. And once I had a bunch of them, I had the artillery to kind of create whatever I needed to. So through the model, I'm able to kind of construct this and remove it, replace it, adjust it as needed. So it's not something that's set in stone. So the next project, it was in the same semester as the Invisible Cities, and it was kind of still exploring the idea of a city and the composition of a city, and looking at things that are invisible, which doesn't necessarily mean not there, but things that are not straightforwardly in view or in the occupation of someone's mind when going through the city. In this case, this is where the drawing becomes useful, because now we're looking at a much larger scale, and it's about marking where things are and not kind of manipulating it. In the drawing, the colors, it's showing multiple systems of the city, or at least that part, that kind of constrain that site, that make it underutilized. The red is what I considered a barrier. For example, an underpass on a highway. When you look at an underpass on a highway, it's dark, it's shady, you don't want to go under that, you don't know what's under it, so you're not incentivized to go under it. Moments like those in the city create underutilized spaces, and what this project does is to kind of reclaim some of that space. The program kind of developed from the site. In one of the other maps, I show this kind of blue overlay on the city, and that blue overlay is a 50-year projection for the floods. That meaning that in 50 years, the water, sea level, is going to rise up that much, and it's going to cover that plot of land. And that's all based on topography. This is where the kind of abstractness of that, the invisible cities comes in, where it's just the idea. So there's no technicality to this. It was just more of the idea that I create a canal or channel through the project, through the land, and in carving out the land, I'm making space for water. And in the future, that's supposed to be kind of a place for the water to be held. That leads to different programs. Programs meaning things that can happen in the space. So for example, the program of a bedroom is a place for you to sleep in. And the program of this is kind of, I don't want to say endless, but it's still open-ended. So that little canal can be a place where people can have little canoe races. It can be a swimming area that can be filtered out. The research and the kind of choosing where the site is was all done through drawing and through mapping. The direction of the channel, the placement of the cisterns, where the seatings are, where the garden is, the little bridge that connects two areas. Those are all designed through model, because that's something that when you kind of imply where your space is that you're working in, you're setting yourself a framework so you know where to operate upon that small space rather than looking at something at a larger scale. This semester we focused heavily on history. Well, histories. We didn't go down one track of one record of history going like this is what happened. We kind of took multiple, we made it a layered research, so we have different takes on it. We took the site plan of the mosque, and looking at it from the top view, almost looking at it as if it was an aerial, like an airplane passing by and you're looking down. We took out all the buildings so that we can draw the absence of light. Through drawing that, the understanding in what's inside and what's outside becomes visible. It's almost as if you're standing and you can kind of see the shadow being casted ahead of you, and you understand the heights of things, right? For example, if you're looking at a tower that's 50 feet high, but you're looking at it from the top, it's going to come out as a circle. If you're looking at it still from the top and you added shadow cast, you have an understanding of how tall it is based on the shadow cast. And you can precisely measure it in relation to other things. In a mosque, you have the minarets, which are the calling towers, and then you have the main dome, which is the central space of the mosque. And in the drawing, you can see a part of the dome being casted, and then you can see the minarets being casted down. And you start to understand the difference between the little complexes, the schools, the madrasas on the edges, the heights of those in relation to the height of the mosque based on the length of shadows. So what we came up with was making this scaled model of the mosque, but it's a cutaway portion of it. So you only see half of the dome, half of the mosque basically. We elevated on a platform, so you would be able to go under it. There's a cutout open, and you put your head through it, and you're able to kind of look up and see into the mosque. Since it's proportionally scaled, and you're looking at it from such a low perspective, and it's a pretty big model, you kind of get a chance to see not necessarily the true spatial aspects of it, but some aspects of it through its proportions and through its physicality. This is the final project of our first semester, and it was very tough because going into architecture school, you were kind of expected you expect yourself to do something that's much more conventionally architecture. And this was something much more spatial, much more abstract, and I guess in some ways much more artistic than what you would think the traditional conceptions of architecture is. We looked at this painting by an artist named Max Ernst. It's this catalog in a children's book that has photos of animals, and they're all scaled more or less proportionally. He painted over a room from this catalog, and he only left certain figures. So if you look at the image, you see a whale, you see a bear in the back, you see a goat next to it, and then you see some furniture. And that was all purposeful. He wanted to show certain things and take out others without manipulating so much the original document, which was the catalog of animals. So here, it's a layered operation where he has the catalog and he overlays his touch onto it, which is the painting. Terms that the professor used was to create a tectonic armature, which in basic terms means artistic structure holding the composition together. I saw that all of these animals were in this room, and these figures were in this room, different objects, but they're out of scale. So the whale is basically the size of a bear, and in real life, that's not true at all. And even with the perspective he draws the bear at the very end of the room and the whale in the front. And the whale being in the front is super small and the bear in the back is very big, which doesn't make sense. I scaled all these proportional to one another. So if the length of a whale, for example, is 150 feet long, I made the whale 150 feet long. In the model, you get to see the size of the whale, which for example is this, and the bear is this. And I arranged them with a very simple grid, and parts of the room being extruded out to kind of grab onto the other figures that are placed more in the middle of the room. It exasperates the qualities of the painting, but in a model form. You see the whale that fits perfectly in the room is now going through the wall in the model, and that's because of the actual size of it. In a lot of ways, this is truly architecture because you're adding a layer of measurement, a layer of precision, and a layer of order and composition onto it that wasn't there previously. When you pull it away and you extract it from that painting, and you create its own system, you can apply that into a physical space. So in the plans, you get to see the skeletal structure of the whale, because you wouldn't be able to see that from looking at it from the outside. You just see its skin. When we design buildings, we cut a section through the wall to see what's behind the wall, to see the layers that are holding it, the structure, the finish, whatever it might be. This is the epitome of design, which is the working in iterations, working in series. And so in this project, the whole semester was surrounded around the design of an aquatic center. Because once you tell us design a school, there's a certain way the school has to kind of operate. When you're designing a swimming pool, like an aquatic center, your main focus or your main architectural space is the pools there, and then there's other things like the mechanic room, the lockers, the bathrooms, whatever. But those are all secondary. The main thing is the space. What the program asked for, the swimming pool asked for big open space, and that was kind of what kind of pushed us towards the design. The professor went about it the same way. He gave us a syntax, which was a list of words, and we picked and choose the words, and we made them into a sentence. And then the sentence, we'd have to make it physical. So if it's a fluted cylinder with holes, we have to make that. The importance of the project was to kind of manipulate that sentence. And you're not changing the order of the sentence, you're not changing what the final product is, but how you transition from the verbal to the physical. And so the first one I created, which kind of became the canon and started off for the rest of the series, was a fluted and stretched mountain with holes. I would layer blocks of foam and then sketch out what I think would look like the object, what I kind of have an idea of the object. And it was almost as if the artifact was in there. I just had to take off the pieces to kind of reveal it. So as I was carving and smoothing out, I was holding and looking at my model, and I was able to kind of examine it and determine for myself what needed to change, what could be improved a little bit. And that happened not just through one model, it happened through a series of 10 models or whatever it might be. And in each one you see a progression from the previous one, and it takes certain elements from the previous one and pushes it further to give it some architectural elements. We saw these vertical striations, which were these very linear elements, as these very long structural elements that can span over the pool. And in doing that, we finally came up with a certain form of the model that really pushed towards the end of the final system of how it was to be. And what was interesting about those is that you can see the sculptural quality in it. It's not something that can be reproduced mechanically, because it's something that happened through the pressure I felt on the model. As I was cutting into it, I can feel when certain parts are getting weak, because I can feel when the material kind of reaches each other. And at a certain point, you take out the material and then you have a void and you open up into whatever is on the other side. You have that certain effect of the openness, and then that becomes, like, for example, the windows of the project. The final model that we have, the final artifact, was something very solid and very sculptural, and that means giving certain elements more meaning and more depth. In doing that, we have to kind of think of a way that this thing can be constructed. It's no longer a block of foam that I carve away, because when you think about it at a larger scale, you can't have a giant block of stone and then carve away out of it and make a building. It's made up of tiny pieces of systems that are put together. And essentially that's what we did. Some parts of the pink foam is mass, which is like solid pieces, and then some of it is just strips. And those strips can be layered to make certain structural elements. In the project, it became arches. The idea of this project was to create a material that consists of two things, a composite and a binder. Composite being the thing that's like a filler, and that can be like, for example, wood or whatever, and then the binder can be glue, concrete, whatever. It can be like plaster and so on. The professor framed this project in a way that we can make models in the future. I thought about all the waste material that we have in the school, and it was mostly things from the CNC machine. Those machines make a lot of waste material, and my project was essentially just collecting that garbage and making a binder and then bringing it together. It was a very experimental process, and there's a lot of trial and error. The first one I made was very successful, but it was only successful because it was a small piece, it was a small sample size, and when you think about it, you have this much glue, it'll dry up much faster than having something that has this much glue. Once I decided to kind of take it into a bigger scale and I made it the regular size, the size that for the project, it wasn't drying in fast enough, and it didn't have the same strength as the original small cube that I made. So that required me to kind of basically dump out whatever I had, mix again, and I had to add certain aspects to it. In this case, I had the glue and I had the foam, and the glue and the foam don't necessarily work together because the foam isn't as porous as wood, for example, or as other materials, as paper. So what I decided to do was I added wood shavings and sawdust. The wood shavings essentially acted as the facilitator between the glue and the foam. So the glue would glue around the wood, the foam would be attached and compressed around the wood, and the woods connecting each other would kind of make a stronger bond between each other than just the foam. The module is a repeatable standard unit that when put together can kind of create something else. And what I wanted to do was make something that had this kind of growing aspect to it that wasn't so monotonous. And it was something that kind of grew on its own based on the pieces that it was made. And the way these pieces are made, it's very simple. It's regular cardboard. I peeled off one side so that the corrugation is available. And these pieces are just triangles, right? And each one has one lip. So that lip acts as an extension for another piece to be attached. So now the pieces are no longer confined to just moving in one face. They have a face that can be extended. And it's really interesting because you have to think about the materiality, especially this was done during COVID, during the beginning of COVID. So there was a lack of material. So I had to use cardboard, which is the only thing available. It was really interesting because it pushes the limits of what the properties of cardboard is. So this corrugation acts as a perfect surface for pieces to come together seamlessly and fit together as joints. So now I can put these pieces on top of each other and slide them as I need to and glue them. This kind of makes certain spaces and certain patterns in the module. Very similar to the Mott Haven project, I decided to kind of start drawing these relationships between barriers. What you see here is the city of Johannesburg in South Africa, and essentially you have the downtown metropolitan area, the prosperous area, the affluent neighborhood, and then below you have these patches over here, the corrugated cardboard. These are old mines from the 30s and the early 1900s where they extracted gold and a ton of other materials, and now they're just these barren wastelands, and you look at them from the aerial view and there's just these patches of void on the ground. These already serve as like a barrier, like no man's land. And then on top of that there's these man-made structures, which is the roads. They're abstracted to show the presence of them and the division that they create between certain spaces. There's this part of the Johannesburg, which is not doing as well as the northern downtown area. There's a giant highway that kind of runs across this strip right here. It serves as a barrier. It's not a physical barrier like a fence that you can't get around. It was not your first choice, or it's not the best choice to go through. And all these smaller arteries are other roads, but these roads serve as a barrier in between these spaces because they cover the view of that. So if you, for example, you look at these spaces from Google Earth and you were to walk through them, you wouldn't be able to see that space. You would just see a fence, or you'd just see bushes, you'd see trees. When you zoom out from this, you start reading certain parts of the city that are deeper and more contextual, rich in history and oppression and everything that's been going on. And it shows those disparities in the model. We explored the city of Vienna during the Anschluss, which is the coming of World War II. It's when Nazi Germany started overtaking many cities in Europe. We did that through this book. It's called Cellar of the Survivors, and it's by this author, Franz Werfel. It's almost written as a biography because it's written as he was himself was being exiled from Vienna because he was Jewish. Because this is an architecture studio, we had to make something architectural of it. We had to create an archifacture, which is a model of sorts that's comprised of found objects, but they're arranged and assembled in a certain way to kind of give off a third effect. I treated the model, the architecture model, the same way I would treat the books, as if it was the margins of the books where you have notes and you underline through the book, so the book becomes a drawing in itself. The model, what it does is that it takes certain aspects of what I drew from the book, which was the protagonist kind of going from space to space, indoors, outdoors, walking through the city. And it's essentially, the essence of it is the walking aspect of him being mobile from one space to another, from one atmosphere to another. There's certain parts of the book where he's in a bar, for example, and he's having a discussion with his comrades about the Nazis coming in and about the kind of the pushing out of the Jews. You can tell that there's so much tension in that moment, and then he kind of walks out and he describes his walk out of that place into the streets, and then walking through the streets into a plaza. What I try to embody in the model is that aspect. And in the same way I annotated the book, I annotated on the model those aspects. For example, the bull was this part that when I imagined him going from that moment of tension to this open space, the plaza, where people come to gather. The objects in themselves have their own inherent quality. Once they're imposed on the model, which is this cork back, it should have the third effect. And the third effect in this case is kind of making these impressions and depressions in the model. The bowl has this gesture, this curving gesture. Therefore, I carved a curved edge around it, and that's where the bull sits. The bull itself has a broken leg, and that's not a quality inherent to the bull, but it's just an instance that happened as I was making the model. Someone dropped the bull, the leg broke. I saw that as an opportunity to further that effect, which was this kind of echoing effect. In other parts, there's this almost catwalk that runs along it, and when you look at it on the model, you're looking at it face on. It kind of seems as if you're walking up and down this mountainside. Then when revealed in the drawings, and this is where the architectural aspect of it comes in, you almost flatten the physicality of that, and that's where the idea of layers comes in, where you're taking out or you're adding layers. When you're looking at the model, it has its own view, and it becomes overwhelming when you're trying to read it. As an architectural drawing, it's a section, so we're cutting through parts of the model. So when you're cutting and you're delving deeper into this object, you're finding out more about it. In any way you read it, it releases another set of readings. I tried to incorporate certain architectural aspects to it so that there was a spatial thing to it, and it wasn't just about the arrangement of these objects and the relationship between them, but rather the object or the artifact serves as a fabric, as a space that can be occupied. So you have this little portal arch which kind of leads to somewhere else, and then you have these pathways that have these holes, and the holes in turn, when you go to the back, they reveal another pathway beneath it that kind of interweave both sides. But now it makes a distinction between the back side and the front side. In the massing of the bottom and the top, you see like it's thicker at the bottom, thinner at the top. There's certain things happening at the bottom, and there's different things happening at the top. Rather than kind of just put them in a way that was this meandering, in this meandering way as I did in the bottom, it was more systematic. It was more organized in its placement. And so these objects had a certain place and they had a certain frame in which they can fit in.
You want to talk about the bell?
The bell. I always appreciate the tactility of models. So that meaning that, I can pick it up, I can flip it around, I can push it a little bit, I can put a pressure on it, and it won't come apart, or it'll do something, it'll react as I do it. I thought a lot about the experience of walking. When you're walking, you're not just moving your feet, you're listening to things, you're smelling different things, you're seeing different frames as you're walking because your perspective changes. And so one of those aspects was the sound. I had this bell, and what I really appreciated was having this aspect that with your movement comes a certain sound, and that kind of follows you. As you're picking up the model and you're moving it around, and you're seeing different parts of the model makes a sound as you're moving it around, as if you're kind of making a mark as to where you're stepping. As a part of the research, we were trying to kind of find sites that related to what we were interested in. And I was interested in this subterranean, above ground, and like this mix in between them. I found a spot which was this portion, it was a canal that was boarded up. Portions of it were exposed and portions of it were covered up. And what I was interested in was kind of revealing that and exposing that. Using these moments, like the bull, for example, as a monument. It stands as a monument in a big open space, as a place of gathering. The staples that run across the arch, I see them as a mode of transportation. In this case, I used modeling as the conception of the project, which was the architecture model. And then I further used modeling to kind of determine the placement of this and how that can be translated into a site that's grounded and has certain spatial qualities that the model does not obtain. So the same curiosity that I had for walking earlier on in the semester, which was kind of embodied in the model and through the readings that we did, I wanted to find a site that had that kind of aspect, that had different experiences, where there was different atmospheres. There was inside and outside, underground, above ground, and so on. There's these contrasting elements. What was conceived at the end was this kind of pathway, something very similar to the High Line, which uses this underutilized space, which is the canal. The canal was used in the early 1900s as a mode of transportation up and down the city, but now there's other modes, which being like automobiles and whatnot. So the canal is kind of rendered useless. It just kind of runs water through the city. These canals were built up over time because of certain diseases, certain pandemics and whatnot, they're now just taking up space and not being recognized, not being used. What I was trying to look forward to was to kind of tap into that and to be able to kind of occupy the space and be able to kind of walk through there and potentially have other things happen in there, having other programs, for example, like shops. For all we know, that can be housing, underground and whatever. What it's made apparent is that architecture is interdependent. It's an interdependent process and practice, in that the mason has his profession, the bricklayer, the construction worker has his profession, and so does the artist with his expression, and so on. What I've learned as the role of the architect is the mediator, the facilitator of those things. And I don't see myself as an aesthetic designer necessarily, but rather I see myself as a composer, arranging these things, arranging these elements and these operations in a certain way to kind of come with a final outcome. And what I hope that final outcome to be is to have an effect on the users or the occupiers of the space. And what I've seen in the past and what I've learned is that those things that have one use or one function or that are built that way, they tend to be in some ways failures because they can only facilitate those one thing. And once that one thing goes away, or once everything around it starts changing, that thing becomes obsolete and therefore becomes like a waste of space and really a waste of architecture.